How the CIA secretly weaponized Hollywood in the Cold War. The lights fade, and the projector hums to life. It's 1954. In a packed London theater, the animated animals of Animal Farm rise against their human oppressor. The audience bursts into applause at the final scene. Tyranny has fallen, freedom restored. But what none of them know is that this wasn't George Orwell's original ending. Someone else had rewritten it. Behind the curtain of Cold War paranoia, one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world had just turned art into a weapon. A few years earlier, George Orwell had died penniless and sick, unaware his work would soon be used for a purpose he might have found chilling. Within months of his death, unknown buyers acquired the film rights to Animal Farm. Those buyers weren't producers or distributors. They were frontmen working for the CIA. The agency had secretly purchased Orwell's story through British intermediaries, bankrolling an independent production to turn his allegory into polished propaganda. The budget ballooned to triple its initial estimate, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the message. In Orwell's book, the pigs became indistinguishable from the humans they replaced, showing that revolutions could devour themselves. In the CIA's version, the animals rise again, overthrowing the pigs, a cinematic twist meant to prove tyranny can be toppled through resistance. It was designed to spark hope, not cynicism, to persuade audiences that totalitarian systems weren't inevitable. The film wasn't just a parable anymore. It was a psychological operation. Thousands of viewers cheered that night, believing they were simply watching an adaptation of literature. They had no idea the edits were dictated from Washington, or that this film was quietly exported across Europe as part of a campaign to counter Soviet propaganda. It would take decades before the truth emerged, that Animal Farm was the CIA's first major foray into manipulating mass entertainment. But this wasn't some isolated experiment. This was the birth of a new type of warfare. The Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs and spies. It was fought through stories, symbols, and screens. To understand why this moment mattered, rewind to the late 194s. The Second World War had left the world split between two superpowers. The Soviet Union controlled half of Europe. The United States, still reeling from victory, confronted a strange reality, a battle for hearts and minds. Leaders in Washington realized that influence, the ability to shape what people believed, feared, and desired, could determine the outcome of this new global standoff. The CIA was created amid that anxiety. It wasn't just about gathering intelligence, it was about weaponizing information. The agency's early architects believed ideas could be mobilized just like armies. Where the Soviets had state-controlled cinema and cultural propaganda, the US had Hollywood. And Hollywood meant influence. Movies reached millions, crossing languages and borders more easily than military alliances ever could. So when the CIA rewrote Animal Farm, it wasn't merely editing a screenplay, it was testing an idea. Could narrative serve as a form of psychological warfare? Could entertainment carry ideology quietly, invisibly, behind the mask of fiction? The early answer was yes. The cheers in that London cinema weren't for American power, they were for the restoration of hope, and that made it the perfect delivery system. Soon the pattern would repeat itself. Films, newsreels, even cultural festivals began to reflect subtle narratives about freedom versus control, prosperity versus oppression, the West versus the rest. Each story added another thread to an invisible web stretching across continents. Beneath the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, another story was being written, one directed not by filmmakers but by covert strategists. In the decades that followed, the same techniques refined in that animated barnyard would be applied on a global scale. The stage had been set, the players cast, and the world would never again watch movies the same way. Because in the Cold War's dark theater of influence, the screen itself had just become a weapon, the birth of a different kind of weapon. The guns had barely fallen silent when a new kind of warfare began, quieter but just as deadly. In 1945, the world emerged from the greatest conflict in human history, only to find itself split down an invisible line. On one side stood the United States and its allies, on the other the Soviet Union. Each claimed victory, but neither trusted the peace that followed. Cities were in ruins, economies shattered, and faith in governments fragile. Out of that wreckage came a contest not just for territory, but for belief itself. The battlefield was no longer only physical, it was psychological. The Americans had watched the Soviets move quickly to consolidate their influence across Eastern Europe. Communist parties? took root in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest, each city adopting the same cultural blueprint: art that celebrated the worker, schools that praised the state, and films that glorified the revolution. Soviet cinema wasn't entertainment, it was evangelism for Marxism. To Western leaders, it was proof that ideology could be projected as power just as surely as a nuclear weapon. In Washington, that realization changed everything. The newly minted Central Intelligence Agency, established by the National Security Act of 1947, was more than just a successor to wartime intelligence. It was conceived as a peacetime instrument of influence, a way to keep the world aligned against the Soviet model. Its architects weren't only soldiers or spies. Many came from academia, journalism, and the arts, people who understood that narratives could move populations in ways brute force couldn't. Among them was Frank Wisner, a lawyer-turned-intelligence officer with an unusual vision. He believed that the United States needed what he called a mighty Wurlitzer, a global instrument the government could play to make entire populations hum to its desired tune. The metaphor was simple. When you pressed a key in Washington, the same melody would be heard in Paris, Rome, or Berlin. The keys in this case were journalists, artists, authors, and eventually filmmakers. Cultural output was no longer just a domain of artists. It was seen as an extension of statecraft. But there was a problem. America's democratic values made overt propaganda politically toxic. Unlike the Soviets, the U.S. couldn't just nationalize its film studios or dictate what stories were told. The solution, Wisner realized, was infiltration by invitation, subtle guidance through funding, partnerships, or mutual ideology. The CIA didn't need to own Hollywood. It only needed to whisper in the right ears. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union had been doing the opposite for decades. From Eisenstein's montages of heroic revolutionaries to wartime epics like Alexander Nevsky, Moscow had long understood cinema's potential to craft loyalty. Their model was centralized, total, and ruthlessly efficient. Every reel that left Soviet studios carried a political payload. The heroism of the worker, the wisdom of the party, the corruption of capitalism. It was all part of the same cinematic language, repeated until it felt like truth. The Americans saw that system and realized they were outmaneuvered. Their films might dominate commercial markets, but the ideological battlefield was slipping away. European audiences, battered by war, were increasingly drawn to the utopian rhetoric of socialism. To them, American prosperity looked decadent, maybe even hollow. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories and roads, but cultural influence required something more potent: mythology. Inside early CIA briefings, the term psychological warfare stopped sounding hypothetical. It became doctrine. The agency's Office of Policy Coordination, established in 1948, was tasked with defending democracy through covert influence. This meant financing radio broadcasts, sponsoring cultural festivals, and infiltrating press outlets under foreign-sounding names. But Wisner's ultimate ambition was cinema, the most glamorous, persuasive medium of them all. Here's where it gets complicated. The American film industry was already a global juggernaut. Hollywood's reach extended to Europe, Asia, and then America, selling not only entertainment but also a worldview, one built on freedom, wealth, and individual heroism. What Wisner understood was that this existing machinery didn't need to be reinvented. It only needed calibration. A small shift in what kind of hero appeared on screen, what kind of villain opposed him, could tilt perceptions worldwide. A love story could quietly reinforce capitalist ideals. A spy thriller could romanticize American intervention. A cartoon could turn the complex fight against communism into a simple tale of good versus evil. But getting the industry to cooperate required subtlety. The CIA couldn't simply walk into a studio and hand over talking points. Instead, influence flowed through intermediaries, producers with government ties, cultural organizations funded indirectly by U.S. agencies, and foreign offices managing film distribution abroad. The structure was deliberately opaque. Each layer distanced the agency from its creations, making the manipulation invisible. At the same time, Washington's official diplomacy relied heavily on hard power, nuclear deterrence, alliances, and aid programs. Yet the thinkers inside the CIA recognized that hard power couldn't sustain alliances alone. Populations needed to believe in the American promise. So while generals strategized about missiles, another team was charting storyboards, narratives designed to resonate across borders, shaping how foreign audiences saw both themselves and their supposed enemies. Hollywood was the perfect testing ground. During the war, filmmakers had partnered closely with the U.S. government through the Office of War Information, producing morale-boosting epics that blurred patriotism with entertainment. That relationship never truly ended. When peace returned, the Pentagon withdrew, but intelligence operatives stepped quietly into the vacuum. They preferred to influence rather than instruct, smoothing alliances behind the screen instead of in front of cameras. By the early 195s, the CIA's psychological warfare branch had evolved into a sprawling operation. Funds were funneled through non-governmental foundations that supported cultural events, academic journals, and yes-film projects. What these beneficiaries often didn't know was that their grants originated in Langley's shadow ledger. This approach gave the agency plausible deniability while ensuring the message stayed consistent. Freedom was glamorous, communism dreary, the West vibrant, the East oppressive. Every success reinforced Wisner's Wurlitzer analogy. When a narrative favorable to American interests appeared in a European newspaper, or a film portraying Soviet cruelty premiered in London, the melody played a little louder. And to the agency's satisfaction, most of its audience danced without ever knowing they were part of the orchestra. What began as a series of improvised experiments soon crystallized into policy. Culture became a vital front in the Cold War, as crucial as the arms race or the space race. The CIA wasn't manufacturing bombs, it was manufacturing consent. And it discovered that a well-told story, distributed through the glitter of cinema, could reach deeper than any broadcast or pamphlet ever could. This was the birth of that different kind of weapon, a weapon of ideas. It didn't rely on steel or firepower, but on emotion. It operated not on the battlefield, but in the imagination. The figures who wielded it weren't soldiers, but writers, directors, critics, some witting, some not. Yet their combined influence was enormous. While politicians argued over borders, Hollywood was already redrawing minds. As the curtain rose in the first decade of the Cold War, that weapon was ready for deployment. Art had become strategy. Storytelling had become statecraft. And the agency that once specialized in espionage now held the most powerful tool of all, the ability to decide which stories the world believed. The cultural Cold War begins. Frank Wisner's mighty Wurlitzer was no metaphor anymore. It started to play. Across post-war Europe, the CIA quietly built a network of organizations designed to shape the cultural battlefield. The idea wasn't to bludgeon audiences with propaganda, but to persuade them through prestige and sophistication, to win minds without them realizing they were targets. In the late 194s, this strategy took form under the newly created Office of Policy Coordination, the branch responsible for covert political and psychological operations. Its mission? Make democracy look irresistible and communism look joyless. Washington feared that the Marshall Plan's money couldn't buy loyalty on its own. Streets could be rebuilt, but trust had to be engineered. So the CIA turned to an older instrument, culture itself. Music, literature, theater, and especially film, all could communicate freedom better than any speech from the State Department. But there was a catch. The United States couldn't be seen dictating tastes or censoring ideas. Overt propaganda smelled too much like the enemy's playbook. The solution was to make influence look organic. That's where front organizations came in. One of the most influential was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, founded in 195 and funded through covert CIA channels. It appeared to be an independent association of intellectuals united by their belief in free expression. Behind the scenes, it was a psychological operations arm of U.S. foreign policy. The Congress organized music festivals, art exhibitions, and symposia in major European cities, lavish events showcasing the vibrancy of Western creativity. Jazz concerts in Paris, abstract art in Venice, modernist plays in Berlin, all presented as spontaneous expressions of liberty. Attendees never saw the budget lines hidden under innocuous foundations like the Far Field Foundation or the Ford-backed organizations that received CIA reimbursements. Wisner and his colleagues understood that prestige was ammunition. High culture mattered because the Soviets had long promoted themselves as intellectuals of the proletariat. By funding artists who championed individual expression, the CIA could demonstrate that freedom outperformed control. It wasn't just about defeating Marxism, it was about redefining what it meant to be modern. Journalism was an especially potent instrument. Under Operation Mockingbird's early framework, friendly editors at major newspapers and magazines were quietly recruited to spread viewpoints that aligned with American policy. Some received direct money. Others simply shared the ideology of resisting communism. These journalists became hidden amplifiers. A magazine in Paris might publish an essay celebrating Western art as a reflection of free minds, while another in Rome attacked the uniformity of Soviet realism. Both were orchestrated by Washington's unseen hand. What made this new front so dangerous was its subtlety. Soviet propaganda was authoritarian, marching portraits and heroic workers. American messaging traded in style and aspiration. Where the Soviets told people what to believe, the CIA encouraged them to feel what freedom looked like. Hollywood's glossy romances, jazz's improvisation, Pollock's chaotic canvases, they all conveyed one psychological message. In America, the individual mattered. Nobody needed to declare ideology when modern life itself served as proof of the system's superiority. The network spread fast. The CIA's cultural officers sponsored literary journals like Encounter and Monad, where writers such as Stephen Spender and Melvin Lasky advanced sophisticated arguments against totalitarianism without ever naming their benefactors. Poets were paid to attend conferences on freedom of thought. Critics were flown to festivals to judge avant-garde films that conveniently mirrored anti-Stalinist themes. Entire art movements, from abstract expressionism to experimental theater, gained global prestige, backed unknowingly by intelligence funds. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Moscow saw American jazz and cinema as toxic exports corrupting Soviet youth. That perception thrilled CIA planners. Every banned film, every censored album proved how threatening cultural freedom truly was. To them, the arts weren't side projects. They were evidence that ideas could erode authoritarian control faster than any tank division. In the same period, Hollywood was evolving too. Though most filmmakers had no direct contact with Langley, the cultural tide affected them. Scripts suddenly mirrored the rhetoric of freedom. American heroes defended democracy abroad or exposed tyranny at home. Even when intelligence agencies weren't mentioned, their ideals resonated through optimistic stories of perseverance and individual triumph. The CIA didn't need to control every film. It only needed the atmosphere of cultural competition to shape what studios deemed patriotic or marketable. By the early 195s, Wisner's office essentially ran an empire of ideas. It funded symphony tours, literary prizes, translation projects, even academic conferences critiquing Soviet philosophy. The machinery was vast yet invisible. Foreign attendees saw smiling American diplomats. They didn't see the case officers approving expenses. The money flowed through NGOs, universities, and foundation grants, layers of respectability concealing the central command. Each event generated goodwill that no official propaganda could replicate. Internally, the CIA described this initiative as the Cultural Cold War, a campaign to prove that democratic societies produced not only better weapons, but better art. The aim wasn't to eliminate communist culture, but to overwhelm it with vitality. Every jazz riff, every technicolor spectacle became a strategic countermove against drab socialist realism. If the Kremlin staged parades, the Americans staged ideals. And yet there was irony here. Many of the writers and painters who benefited from CIA-backed funding were themselves critics of conformity and authority. They'd have bristled at learning their independence was sponsored by intelligence officers, but secrecy was the whole point. Art worked best as persuasion when it appeared spontaneous, not choreographed. So grants were awarded through intermediaries who never revealed the true source, allowing artists to believe they were simply fortunate recipients of cultural patronage. The model proved so successful that it expanded beyond Europe. Articles praising democracy surfaced in Latin American magazines. African and Asian cultural festivals received anonymous Western sponsors promoting global artistic exchange. Each carried the same subtext: modernity equals freedom equals America. The CIA had discovered that influence scaled like any production. Repeat the formula, adjust for local taste, and export. Meanwhile, the Soviets responded in kind, launching film festivals exalting proletarian courage and sponsoring friendship societies that extolled socialist unity. The world became a two-way theater, each superpower trying to outshine the other's mythology. But America's advantage was its plausible deniability. While Soviet propaganda came stamped with the hammer and sickle, U.S. messaging hid behind celebrity and glamour. Nobody suspected the hand turned the real. By mid-decade, the Cultural Cold War was institutionalized. Departments across the CIA coordinated with the State Department and private philanthropies to ensure messaging coherence.
Success was measured not in overt victories,
but in shifts of sentiment. When European journalists called Soviet art dated, when students in Prague traded state-approved literature for smuggled American novels, those were the psychological metrics that mattered. And through all of it ran the same thread: stories. Whether projected on-screen or printed in journals, they shaped a collective perception of which side represented the future. The genius of the operation was that people rarely realized they were participating in a war at all. They thought they were choosing taste, style, and progress. In truth, they were following a carefully scored script. The CIA's grand orchestra of influence was now global. From the cafes of Paris to the cinemas of Tokyo, its melody played on, light, catchy, and unforgettable. The cultural Cold War had begun in earnest, and the world was humming along to a tune no one realized was written in Langley: Operation Animal Farm. George Orwell never lived to see his fable turned into a weapon. He died in January 1950, weak from tuberculosis, still writing warnings about power and corruption. Within months, CIA operatives began quietly purchasing the rights to his most famous work, not to honor its message, but to reshape it. Through British intermediaries and secret frontmen, the agency acquired the film rights to Animal Farm from Orwell's widow, Sonia Brownell. The deal looked legitimate, British producers offering generous terms, but every pound stemmed from covert U.S. funds. What appeared to be an independent transatlantic production was, in truth, one of the earliest psychological warfare tests of the Cold War. Its clear objective: transform a cautionary fable about the corruption of revolution into a cinematic sermon against Moscow. Production control went to Louis de Rochemont, the American documentarian famed for patriotic wartime features. His reputation as a dependable voice of democracy made him the ideal collaborator. De Rochemont's New York studio managed the picture as a British-American partnership, but paychecks and invoices were padded through CIA, finance fronts that disguised official spending as private capital. Budgets tell the story. By the time the last frame was shot, the final cost had ballooned to more than 3 times the planned £92,790 budget. This overflow was labeled under cultural outreach and consulting, yet CIA accounting books listed each payment as a psychological warfare asset. The inflated cost was not waste. Each extra pound was proof that Washington was investing directly in imagination as a weapon. When early drafts arrived at Langley, intelligence analysts combed through every frame. The original ending, animals and men becoming indistinguishable around the poker table, was flagged as ideologically self-defeating. A memo warned that Orwell's pessimism encouraged moral paralysis. The directive that followed was unambiguous: rewrite the finale to spark resistance, not despair. Agency script consultants replaced fatalism with hope. The animals now stormed the farmhouse once more, toppling their porcine dictators and reclaiming their freedom beneath a rising sun. A declassified note later summarized the decision: hope remains the most effective anti-communist message. The shift was surgical. Animators lightened tones, the composer rewrote the score into a major key, and light flooded every final shot. Propaganda became artistry. Despair turned into triumph. For de Rochemont, the command suited his instincts. A veteran propagandist, he viewed morale building as patriotic duty. His creative team believed they were making art. CIA planners logged emotional reactions as data. Where the studio saw storytelling, the agency saw measurable influence. The film premiered in London in 1954 before a full house. Audiences erupted in applause. Reviews praised its faith in liberty, unaware the ending had come from secret directives in Virginia. Embassy cables report a moving response from viewers cheering freedom restored. Inside Langley, those notes were tabulated as victory metrics. A children's animation had proven cinema could alter political emotion with precision. Distribution completed the operation. The Farfield Foundation and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, both CIA fronts, handled marketing, translations, and festival promotion. Radio Free Europe raffled tickets. Magazines tied to Operation Mockingbird ran glowing reviews authored by agency writers. Each review, every screening across Paris or Rome, was an invisible broadcast of policy wrapped in artistry. To every spectator, the narrative was simple. Tyranny can be overthrown, freedom is reborn, and in that allegory, America was the unspoken guide. Inside headquarters, officers declared Animal Farm a model success. It demonstrated that cinema could reach hearts where pamphlets and speeches failed. Propaganda no longer needed logos of government, only the warmth of sincerity. Encouraged by results, the CIA quietly aided another Orwell adaptation, 1984-1956. The fingerprints were familiar, despair tempered by courage, totalitarian cruelty balanced by human resilience. The film amplified rebellion over hopelessness, proving that the formula could scale. Orwell's words have been inverted into their opposite meaning. His critique of control now served the masters of it. Unlike Soviet pictures that celebrated the KGB, American cinema kept its intelligence services invisible. Yet every Hollywood narrative about vigilance and redemption echoed the same structure Langley had refined. Freedom threatened by tyranny, restored by courage. The method spread like template code through thrillers, epics, and animated tales alike. Documents declassified decades later confirmed the entire web: CIA financing, script interference, and covert global promotion under the banner of cultural freedom. A barnyard fable had become a morale operation, its altered ending repositioning despair as defiance. Animal Farm thus stands as the first full-scale experiment in cinematic social engineering, a precedent for all later cultural operations. Sonia Orwell never learned the truth. In later reminiscence, she called the producers charming men. They were charmed with protocol, politeness, the camouflage of power. Her husband's warning about manipulation had been turned line by line into proof that manipulation worked. By the time Congressional committees stripped secrecy from the program in the 1970s, its influence was already woven into global storytelling. The cheering 1954 audience had not merely applauded a film, they had validated an experiment. Somewhere in Langley's archives, a clip report closed a case file, objective achieved. That single operation became the doctrine of Cold War propaganda. On the screen, animals reclaimed freedom. Off the screen, the United States had learned to rule the imagination. Into the studio system. By the mid-1950s, Hollywood was once again the brightest stage on Earth. Award shows glittering, box office booming, big studios flourishing after years of wartime constraint. To most moviegoers, the Dream Factory seemed untouched by politics. But inside a handful of studio offices, quiet visitors were beginning to appear, consultants with government ties, cultural liaisons, and well-connected producers who spoke fluently about patriotism. They didn't flash badges, yet somehow their suggestions carried weight. The CIA had learned the power of working in shadows. Now it aimed those shadows at the silver screen. The success of Animal Farm convinced planners inside the agency that film could move entire populations more effectively than pamphlets ever could. So they shifted from single projects to strategic partnerships. In effect, the CIA started cultivating Hollywood the same way it had cultivated journalists, selectively, through influence rather than command. A memo from an internal working group described cinema as a psychological instrument of projection, a weapon whose ammunition was story. The next step was embedding the message directly into mainstream entertainment without alerting the audience or the industry. The 195 studio system offered the perfect camouflage. Productions were massive collaborations with dozens of writers, editors, and corporate funders. Adding one more consultant or technical advisor drew little notice. Within this environment, the agency found willing allies, producers like Daryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox, who had worked with the government during the war, and directors such as John Ford and Frank Capra, whose earlier military films fused propaganda with artistry. These men already believed cinema served national purpose. Quiet discussions over lunches in Los Angeles or Washington made that alignment official. Hollywood's relationship with the government wasn't new. During World War II, the Office of War Information had freely advised studios on morale films. What changed in the Cold War was scale and subtlety. Now the guidance came unofficially, through whispers rather than memoranda. Scripts touching on espionage, international intrigue, or ideological conflict sometimes passed through back channels for accuracy checks. Those reviews could stretch into rewrites, emphasizing American virtue and collective strength. Studios eager to maintain good relations or to secure military cooperation for action sequences usually accepted the notes without question. The influence wasn't always centralized within Langley. The State Department, the United States Information Agency, USIA, and film divisions of the Marshall Plan all overlapped in their goals, projecting an image of freedom, prosperity, and stability. The CIA often acted as the silent coordinator, ensuring that the narrative tone remained consistent across media. Where the Soviets exported grand socialist dramas to satellite states, America exported glamour and optimism. Musicals, comedies, and adventure films had made democracy look like a lifestyle. Contemporaries who later examined production files noticed a pattern. Films shot with government assistance tended to portray American institutions as benevolent and efficient, while their adversaries, sometimes unnamed foreign powers, displayed characteristics uncomfortably close to Soviet stereotypes. Even when villains weren't Russian, they embodied the same paranoia and rigidity. Film historians would later trace this formula through dozens of thrillers produced between 1953 and 196. Each seemed to whisper the same message: individual freedom triumphs over collective oppression. Meanwhile, in Britain, the CIA's cultural allies were busy with another Orwell adaptation, 1984-1956. Though direct documentation is scarce, reviewers noted its sharper anti-communist tone compared with the novel. References to class struggle softened, scenes of personal defiance amplified. The irony went unnoticed by audiences who saw merely another dystopian drama. To the agency, it proved a method scalable. Sponsor art that reinforced democratic resilience without stamping it propaganda. Influence also flowed through film festivals. The CIA and the USIA sponsored prints of select Hollywood features for European tours, often entering them into Venice or Cannes competitions under the guise of cultural exchange. Each victory on that circuit, each standing ovation, was treated in Langley as a psychological success, proof that American stories still dominated global imagination. When a Soviet critic called Hollywood the spiritual arm of capitalism, an internal memo reportedly quoted the line with satisfaction. It was precisely the point. Inside Los Angeles, cooperation deepened through informal councils linking producers with government public relations officers. One recurring hub was the motion picture service of the armed forces, technically separate from the CIA but overlapping in personnel. A message from Washington might arrive suggesting heroic portrayals of freedom fighters in Eastern Europe or sympathetic roles for American diplomats abroad. The advice usually reached writers through studio heads who wanted to stay on the right side of policy. No coercion required, just shared incentives. Patriotic films sold well. By this stage, the studio system itself functioned like Frank Wisner's Mighty Wurlitzer. If you pressed the key of patriotism in Washington, the melody played across California's sound stages. One example often cited is the wave of Cold War thrillers after 1954. The Iron Curtain, I Was a Communist for the FBI, and My Son John. None carried CIA logos, but all mirrored the agency's narrative priorities: vigilance, moral clarity, redemptive faith in American democracy. Their villains weren't cartoonish. They were tragic converts broken by ideology, a reflection of internal fear projected outward. Distribution was equally strategic. Through partnerships with major exhibitors and overseas cultural offices, certain films received unusually wide releases in contested regions. The USIA arranged dubbing and subtitling, while embassy cultural attaches hosted screenings wrapped in rhetoric about artistic freedom. Each viewing was a diplomatic gesture disguised as entertainment. Soviet intelligence reports complained about ideological infiltration through cinema, an unintended compliment that confirmed success. Back home, many filmmakers sensed the climate. The House Un-American Activities Committee had already blacklisted dozens suspected of communist sympathy. Studios, desperate to demonstrate patriotism, welcomed official endorsement. The CIA had no need to threaten or bribe. Fear and ambition kept the machine aligned. When executives boasted that Hollywood was the free world storyteller, they echoed propaganda more eloquently than any briefing could have scripted. Technically, direct contact between the CIA and studio production units remained rare, but the ecosystem itself saturated with influence. Former intelligence officers moved easily into public relations and script consulting. Journalists tied to Operation Mockingbird promoted forthcoming films as triumphs of liberty. Even entertainment trade journals framed cinematic success as evidence of capitalist vitality. It was a symphony of self-reinforcement. By 1958, transatlantic cooperation had merged into a single rhythm. The USIA shipped reels of Hollywood spectacles to Africa and Asia, while Radio Free Europe broadcast discussions about their universal values. Soviet propagandists fumed, accusing Western cinema of poisoning moral sensibility with consumerist fantasy. Yet audiences behind the Iron Curtain risked punishment to watch smuggled American features. To them, jeans, jazz, and Technicolor sunsets spoke louder than political leaflets. The agency had proven its thesis again: emotion outmaneuvered ideology. Still, there were limits. Some within Langley worried that overtly patriotic themes might backfire, making America look insincere. Analysts recommended subtler storytelling, romantic comedies where prosperity was implicit, or science fiction allegories warning of conformity. The shift arrived just in time for the 196's boom of cerebral thrillers, paving the way for both satire and sophistication. Intelligence no longer needed to dictate morals, it only needed to nurture the market that rewarded them. Through it all, the CIA maintained official denial. No contracts bore its name, no credits listed its officers. Yet across studio boards and distribution chains ran invisible threads of patronage and persuasion. The arrangement suited everyone. Filmmakers got funding or access. The agency got influence. The result was a marketplace of narratives aligned by coincidence or design with American geopolitical interests. What emerged from this quiet partnership was more durable than any propaganda film, an entire commercial industry that instinctively favored the Western ideal. The line between national image and box office entertainment blurred beyond recognition. By decade's end, Hollywood no longer needed guidance. It was fluent in the language of the Cold War. The CIA had tuned the instrument and stepped back, content to let the melody play itself. Operation Mockingbird, the wider media web. While Hollywood flickered in the spotlight, another kind of theater was unfolding behind newsroom doors. By the late 195s, the CIA's fascination with influence had widened far beyond film. Its operatives were no longer content with directing scripts. They wanted to steer the stories printed in morning papers and broadcast over radios. The strategy wasn't about one grand conspiracy, but thousands of small linemen, each journalist or editor nudged in just the right direction. This sprawling network became known inside intelligence circles as Operation Mockingbird, a name that would later haunt the agency's public image. It began quietly after World War II when the newly formed CIA realized that information could travel faster than diplomacy. Many European reporters already held anti-communist sympathies, and that ideological overlap made cooperation easy. Under the guiding hand of Frank Wisner, the same architect behind the mighty Wurlitzer, agents started cultivating relationships with journalists abroad. They offered funding, leads, or exclusive access to official sources. In return, those writers amplified stories favorable to American policy, some knowingly, others unaware their patrons reported back to Langley. At home, the lines blurred further. National newspapers, foreign correspondents, magazine editors all became conduits for messaging disguised as independent reporting. The arrangement was pragmatic. The press delivered reach the government couldn't. And in an era when communist parties still competed for influence within Western democracies, controlling the tone of coverage was seen as essential to national security. Some of these collaborations were straightforward briefings, others crossed into covert recruitment. Declassified documents show that by the early 195s, dozens of accredited journalists had official but confidential relationships with the CIA. Their tasks ranged from transmitting field observations to planning stories written by agency staff under bylines that lent them legitimacy. For every participant who took payment, another cooperated out of patriotic conviction. The result was a media ecosystem humming in sync with Washington's objectives, rarely needing direct orders. The phrase Operation Mockingbird first appeared publicly in the 197s, but the idea predated the code name. The concept was simple. A mockingbird repeats what it hears. News outlets around the world echoed narratives crafted in Washington, whether about Soviet aggression, American generosity, or the moral superiority of the free world. Each repetition lent credibility. Each article became one more note in Wisner's global symphony. Overseas, American news agencies provided convenient cover for intelligence work. Correspondents stationed in Eastern Europe collected gossip alongside headlines, relaying political insights back to the embassy. Sometimes agency staff posed as reporters, Sometimes reporters doubled as agency assets. The overlap was so common that even editors lost track of who was informing whom. International bureaus of newspapers like Time and Newsweek often shared office space with other cultural organizations funded through the same intermediaries as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. At the operational level, Langley maintained plausible deniability. Contacts were handled to the Office of Policy Coordination, the same unit overseeing cultural projects. Payments flowed through front foundations or friendly publishers. What mattered wasn't secrecy, it was distance. If exposure came, responsibility could be disavowed as individual initiative rather than institutional design. When cracks finally appeared in the system 2 decades later, they traced back to the Watergate era. In December 1974, the New York Times published journalist Seymour Hersh's expose describing illegal CIA surveillance on U.S. citizens. The revelations triggered congressional outrage and led to Senator Frank Church's investigative committee the following year. During testimony, officials reluctantly confirmed fragments of rumor. At least 50 journalists had collaborated directly with the agency. The admission stunned the public, which sends Langley, veterans considered a low estimate. The Church Committee's report avoided names but acknowledged a substantial relationship between intelligence operations and the press. For the first time, the orchestra's echoes were audible. Yet this was only the prelude to a greater revelation. In 1977, Carl Bernstein, better known for uncovering Watergate, published a lengthy investigation in Rolling Stone. He claimed that more than 400 American press members had secretly undertaken CIA assignments. His article mapped out an entire architecture of influence, reporters gathering intelligence during overseas trips, editors approving planted narratives, and owners quietly cooperating for patriotic reasons. Prominent media figures appeared in Bernstein's account. Syndicated columnist Joseph and Stuart Alsop traveled on CIA-arranged missions. Executives like CBS's William Paley provided logistical support. Even editors at leading newspapers allegedly knew of certain correspondents' dual loyalties. For ordinary readers, the revelation crushed the illusion of a free, independent press. For Washington insiders, it simply confirmed a long-standing practice formalized during the Cold War's most anxious years. Not everyone agreed on the label Operation Mockingbird. Historian David Hadley later argued that journalist Deborah Davis exaggerated the program's scope in her 1979 book Catherine the Great, where she described Wisner's creation as a coordinated empire for propaganda. Declassified files back Hadley's skepticism. The CIA's Project Mockingbird reference in the 1963 Family Jewels documents referred only to a brief wiretap operation, not wholesale media control. Still, the broader truth was undeniable. The agency had built deep, systematic ties with the press, even if the network was less centralized than legend suggested. Behind semantics lay the substance. The newspapers and broadcasts of the 195s and 60s consistently mirrored U.S. strategic interests. Stories of Soviet brutality spread quickly. Humanitarian angles emphasized Western aid, and dissenting voices inside Allied nations found themselves marginalized. Few readers questioned it. The alignment felt natural. After all, freedom and democracy were the guiding ideals of the time. Mockingbird simply ensured those ideals sang in key. International outreach magnified the effort. The CIA leveraged major wire services to shape headlines before they reached foreign readers. Articles originating in independent European outlets were sometimes ghostwritten in English, translated and re-exported under continental bylines. Through agencies like the United States Information Service, these narratives reached millions across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, regions where open propaganda might have backfired. The aim was subtle influence, create the impression of consensus. If every paper from London to Caracas echoed the same interpretation of an event, it didn't feel like messaging. It felt like truth. Even entertainment journalism played a role. Lifestyle pieces celebrating American prosperity or celebrity freedom contrasted implicitly with descriptions of Soviet austerity. Cultural coverage became propaganda by tone rather than content. Audiences who adored Hollywood stars were also absorbing a worldview: freedom as glamour, capitalism as joy. Through this channel, film and news fused into one sustained performance of superiority. When the Church Committee hearings ended in 1976, the CIA publicly pledged to discontinue using journalists as covert assets. But policing that boundary proved nearly impossible. Influential correspondents maintained friendships with former handlers. Information still flowed informally. The Mockingbird brand had become too toxic to continue openly, yet its technique survived in new guises: strategic briefings, leak management, and selective access. The symbiosis between government and media had simply evolved into a subtler form of mutual convenience. The scandal scarred the American press. Editors installed stricter ethics codes. Universities added courses on media independence. Yet for many observers, the damage was permanent. The revelation that patriotic storytelling had served as covert policy blurred the moral line between journalism and psychological warfare. What readers once considered objective truth now looked, in hindsight, like an elegant campaign. Curiously, while newspapers faced accountability, Hollywood escaped scrutiny. Films remained cultural exports with plausible innocence, their soft propaganda overshadowed by the more shocking image of correspondents on the CIA payroll. In reality, both worlds were extensions of the same philosophy, that stories could secure alliances faster than treaties. By combining emotional persuasion with institutional credibility, the United States had mastered a hybrid weapon, one that fired headlines and scripts instead of bullets. Looking back, Operation Mockingbird wasn't a single conspiracy, but a method, proof that influence could be decentralized yet effective. Even historians arguing over numbers agree on this point. When 400 voices repeat similar truths across borders, the echo itself becomes power. The CIA understood that better than anyone. The war for public perception demanded no uniforms, no declarations. It required only a chorus willing to sing the right melody. And that melody traveled everywhere, through cinema, radio, magazines, and wire reports until it surrounded both enemies and allies alike. By the time the final notes reached home audiences, few could tell who composed the tune. They only knew it sounded reassuringly familiar. The intelligence world called it Mockingbird. The rest of the world simply called it news, shaping global perception. By the early 196s, American culture had conquered cinemas, airwaves, and living rooms across the planet. But this wasn't just a triumph of entertainment, it was strategy. Washington had realized that a musical, a sitcom, or an adventure serial could rewrite how entire societies imagined prosperity and freedom. The CIA's cultural programs entered a new phase, less about single projects and more about saturation, making the American way of life feel universal. On this front, film was still the most potent weapon, and now it would be deployed internationally like psychological artillery. In Europe, post-war reconstruction had left audiences yearning for color, optimism, and distraction. Hollywood supplied all three. Lavish epics like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments screened in newly built theaters funded under the Marshall Plan's cultural grants. Those technicalities mattered. The CIA often advised on which films benefited diplomatic goals. Religious themes stressing individual salvation subtly undercut the collectivist morality of Soviet cinema. Even lighthearted comedies got strategic distribution. A happy housewife in a suburban kitchen, a mechanic who becomes his own boss. These images function as silent essays on capitalism's promise. Langley's cultural officers worked through intermediaries like the United States Information Agency and embassy outreach programs. They arranged film festivals framed as Freedom Weeks or Art and Democracy showcases. Titles varied by region, but the subtext never changed. Creativity equals liberty equals America. Sometimes the CIA funded the prize money itself, ensuring that politically resonant films won top honors. In other cases, they quietly paid for subtitling, making sure translations preserved ideological nuances. A single line lost in translation could blunt a message, so fluent case officers reviewed scripts before foreign releases. The reach extended far beyond Europe. In Asia, U.S. cultural centers screened American movies in air-conditioned halls that became oases from monsoon heat and political turbulence. Audiences drawn by romance or adventure left with lasting impressions of abundance, cars gleaming, cities buzzing, people unafraid of authority. In Japan, post-occupation censorship still shaped local media, but imported Hollywood spectacles introduced new archetypes of modernity. CIA, USIA staff watched ticket sales as data points in their psychological graphs. Each packed showing proved that desire itself was aligning with the West. Africa presented a different challenge, newly decolonized nations balancing superpower courtship. Washington feared Soviet agitprop would paint America as another imperial master. To counter that, Cultural officers distributed films about racial progress and personal opportunity. They financed mobile cinemas, trucks with projectors that toured villages under banners reading world friendship films. Officially, these programs were humanitarian. Unofficially, they were designed to attach optimism to American identity. A generation of young viewers grew up associating the USA with laughter, music, and endings that promised redemption. Throughout Latin America, the approach blended showmanship with subtle politics. Since direct propaganda risked backlash, the CIA relied on local promoters. Studios licensed westerns and family dramas at deep discounts. Embassies hosted screenings in plazas decorated with American flags and Coca-Cola stands. Critics later observed that these events often coincided with regional elections or labor unrest. Entertainment doubled as reassurance that aligning with Washington meant stability and modern comfort. Langley analysts described these operations as psychological bandages. They couldn't cure poverty, but they could soothe discontent long enough for politics to operate. Even the festival circuit became a battlefield. In Venice, Cannes, and Berlin, juries adored American productions, unaware that some cultural foundations sponsoring their events were agency fronts. When a socially conscious drama portrayed Soviet life as grim or bureaucratic, its prestige win wasn't accidental, it was investment yield. Internal memoranda celebrated such moments as victories of perception. A gold medal meant one less headline about U.S. militarism. Prestige converted effortlessly into persuasion. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet propagandists noticed. They responded with dazzling epics like The Fall of Berlin or Ballad of a Soldier, films that sanctified sacrifice and comradeship. State newspapers condemned Hollywood's degenerate hedonism. But privately, officials worried about cinema's magnetic pull. KGB reports complained that smuggled reels of American movies were circulating in Leningrad basements, undermining socialist discipline. The CIA read those same reports through intercepted channels and concluded the experiment was working precisely as intended. Infiltration by aspiration. Propaganda analysts inside Langley referred to this as image warfare. Unlike overt broadcasts, movies required no translation of intent. Seeing an on-screen grocery store overflowing with goods did more for capitalism's prestige than any policy speech. When East German youth danced a rock and roll after watching smuggled films, Washington chalked it up as a quiet win. Ideology was losing ground to rhythm and color. The Soviet Union might outproduce tanks, but it couldn't mass-produce envy. Parallel to film, the agency coordinated with the private sector to amplify these impressions. Advertising firms like McInerney and cultural consultants from Madison Avenue shared insights with officials about emotional resonance. What kinds of imagery created trust? Which symbols crossed borders? The takeaway was consistent. Abundance sold better than ideology. Soon, American consumer branding dovetailed perfectly with diplomatic messaging. Coke commercials, jazz tours, and cinema all carried the same emotional undercurrent. Being American meant being free to choose, to enjoy, to dream. This multimedia onslaught blurred commercial and political lines. Abroad, the same children watching Cinderella might later attend English classes at U.S. cultural institutes, showing documentaries on life in a free country. Packages of educational materials included pamphlets on women's empowerment and workers' productivity, quiet counters to Soviet narratives of equality. None of it looked like propaganda. It felt like aspiration. The agency called that the camouflage of desire. Internally, analysts debated ethics. Was influencing movie preferences morally different from influencing elections? Some argued that promoting optimism was defensive, not deceptive. Others feared that turning art into policy eroded credibility at home. But the momentum was unstoppable. The Soviet bloc's rigid imagery couldn't compete with the kaleidoscope of America's cultural exports. Even European allies began reproducing the formula. France with stylish thrillers, Italy with prosperity comedies, extensions of the same vision of the good life aligned with Western markets. By the mid-1960s, the CIA's direct hand grew lighter. Commerce now carried the message unaided. Hollywood no longer needed secret funding. Its blockbuster economy ran on audiences who already believed in its myths. Still, cultural officers tracked the outcomes carefully. Surveys from West Berlin, Manila, and Lagos all showed identical associations. Words like freedom, modern, and hopeful linked instinctively to American art. Those correlations were triumphal graphs pinned inside the Directorate of Plans, evidence that cinema had re-engineered perception globally. Meanwhile, Soviet efforts faltered. Their films remained technically brilliant but emotionally contained. Where Hollywood invited laughter and romance, Soviet pictures delivered lessons, and audiences, even sympathetic ones, preferred laughter. Washington intelligence interpreted box office data like battle reports. In a 1965 internal review, an analyst described the situation succinctly: "We no longer sell policy, we sell possibility." That phrase captured the era's quiet revolution. The agency had moved from shaping content to shaping context, the expectation that America represented the future. Every exported musical, every Western, every glossy magazine feature layered that message deeper until it seemed like common sense. Decades later, historians would call it soft power. At the time, the CIA called it success. By the end of the decade, global perception had shifted so profoundly that propaganda became self-generating. Filmmakers worldwide emulated Hollywood formulas, perpetuating ideals originally engineered in secret. The screen had become an echo chamber of freedom myths. When astronauts planted the American flag on the moon in 1969, billions watched through the very medium the agency had spent 2 decades perfecting. It was the ultimate broadcast, cinema and reality merging into proof that the future belonged to the storytellers. Ethical gray zones and artistic manipulation. By the late 196s, the CIA's cultural empire had matured into something neither wholly sinister nor easily defensible. Inside Langley, analysts debated it with the same gravity they gave to covert military operations. Was shaping cinema an act of defense or deceit? Nobody agreed. What had started as a tool against communist propaganda had become an ethical labyrinth, one where freedom and manipulation blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. Many filmmakers and writers who benefited from covert funding had no idea they were part of a psychological operation. Grants flowed through respectable foundations, film councils, and cultural institutes. Scripts were purchased, translations commissioned, screenings arranged, all under the neutral language of artistic exchange. Only later, when declassified memos surfaced, did participants realize their creative independence had been stage managed from afar. It raised painful questions. Could art still be considered free if its freedom had been engineered? For some inside the agency, the answer was pragmatic. They saw themselves as guardians of an open world, fighting a regime that censored music, burned books, and erased dissent. If nudging artists preserved liberty, it was a lesser evil. "We gave them freedom of expression," one retired officer later remarked. "We just guided where that expression pointed." But that logic cut both ways. By deciding which voices merited amplification, the CIA had become a kind of invisible censor, rewarding some visions of freedom while muting others that questioned American power itself. The paradox deepened with George Orwell. No symbol better captured the irony of cultural manipulation than the author who'd spent his life dissecting propaganda. Through Animal Farm in 1984, he warned that truth becomes meaningless once language is bent for political ends. Yet after his death, his own words were rewritten to serve those ends. To agency strategists, the revision wasn't betrayal but optimization. Orwell's warning had to be reframed as hope. Still, for purists, it was blasphemy, a reminder that even righteous propaganda corrodes the art it touches. Artists who eventually discovered the hidden sponsorship felt ambivalent. Some were furious, saying their independence retroactively tainted. Others shrugged, admitting that without CIA-linked patrons, their work might never have reached audiences at all. The abstract painters of New York, whose exhibitions toured Europe under cultural freedom banners, embodied that contradiction. They were celebrated as rebels against conformity while unknowingly starring in Washington's most sophisticated marketing campaign. Within academic circles, the moral reckoning arrived slowly. Scholars began tracing how post-war artistic movements mirrored strategic narratives. Abstract expressionism, jazz diplomacy, literary modernism, they all championed the individual against the collective, a theme perfectly suited to Cold War competition. None of it was outright deceit, yet each carried subtle adaptations that aligned with the era's political needs. Historians coin a phrase for this uneasy territory, the Gray Garden of Influence, a place where authentic creativity and covert direction grew side by side, indistinguishable until uprooted. Inside the CIA, some officers sensed the danger of their own success. By the early 197s, younger agents questioned whether constant manipulation cheapened the very ideals they claimed to defend. A confidential memo from the Directorate of Plans warned that unacknowledged sponsorship risk, conflating cultural leadership with control. The worry wasn't moralism, it was strategy. Propaganda exposed becomes counter-propaganda. If the world learned that beloved artworks were covert products, the credibility of freedom itself might collapse. Meanwhile, the artistic community was developing its own backlash. The counterculture generation, skeptical of authority, turned suspicion toward every institution, including the storytellers of the previous decade. Directors like Stanley Kubrick and writers such as Joseph Heller dismantled patriotic myths through satire and absurdity. Their work wasn't guided by the CIA, but it owed something to the environment the agency had cultivated, a world where politics and narrative were inseparable. Ironically, the same machinery that once promoted optimism had spawned artists determined to expose manipulation itself. At film schools and universities, heated debates followed. Professors asked whether covertly funded creativity could ever claim authenticity. Some pointed out that the Soviets used identical tactics, only openly. The United States, by hiding its hand, might have invented a more insidious model, persuasion wrapped in glamour. The question wasn't just ethical, it was existential. If every frame carried invisible ideology, could any story be trusted? For ordinary audiences, none of this mattered at the time. They continued buying tickets, humming soundtracks, believing the emotions were their own. That innocence was both the success and tragedy of the operation. Propaganda worked best when it felt like choice. Each smile at a Hollywood ending reinforced the system without anyone realizing they'd been recruited by it. Critics after the fact struggled to assign blame. Some condemned the agency for corrupting art's purity. Others argued that art had always served power, from Renaissance patrons to wartime ministries, and the CIA merely updated tradition. The truth lay somewhere between. The Cold War's cultural front didn't invent manipulation. It perfected subtlety. Instead of slogans, it offered stories. Instead of censorship, sponsorship. Audiences weren't coerced, they were charmed. As the details surfaced through congressional investigations in the 197's, public reaction swung between fascination and betrayal. To many Americans, the revelation that their favorite films and magazines were instruments of policy felt surreal. Yet others considered it inevitable. In an age when nuclear codes and film scripts could both shape the fate of nations, persuasion was just another weapon. Ethics, like borders, blurred in the fog. Some former operatives defended their choices until death. They claimed the arts they sponsored outlived communism, proving the strategy worked. Others admitted discomfort. "We played God with culture," one said in an oral history, "and gods tend to forget the people who worship them." That haunting acknowledgement encapsulated the entire dilemma. Power without accountability, morality measured by outcomes rather than means. By the mid-70s, the machinery began winding down under scrutiny, replaced by more transparent partnerships with the Defense Department and public diplomacy offices. But its legacy endured. The concept that narrative equals influence took root in advertising, politics, and even humanitarian campaigns. What began as covert defense became cultural DNA. In retrospect, the ethical gray zone wasn't a phase, it was the defining feature of Cold War storytelling. Artists gained notoriety, governments gained persuasion, and truth floated somewhere in between. The CIA hadn't merely weaponized Hollywood. It had revealed how easily any story could become a tool once people believed in its beauty. And so the paradox remains. The same films that inspired faith in freedom were born from secrecy. The same ideals that condemned propaganda were spread through it. The war of ideas ended without surrender because no side ever stopped fighting. The battleground simply moved from policy rooms to the human imagination. Exposure and reckoning. By the early 197s, the illusion of cultural innocence began to crack. What had once been whispered rumors about government influence turned into front-page headlines. The cause wasn't a scandal in Hollywood, at least not at first. It was Watergate. The same unraveling of secrecy that exposed the White House also ripped open the vaults of U.S. intelligence. And when the leaks began, it wasn't just about break-ins or political spying. It was about decades of manipulation in journalism, art, and entertainment, all hidden behind the curtain of national security. The first tremor came in December 1974, when the New York Times published Seymour Hersh's expose on illegal CIA surveillance of U.S. citizens. Buried in that piece was a passing reference to domestic operations aimed at influencing opinion. Few readers realize it yet, but that phrase pointed to the cultural theater the agency had built for 30 years. Inside Langley, panic spread. The age of total secrecy was ending. Congress could no longer ignore it. By early 1975, Senator Frank Church of Idaho convened a special committee to investigate alleged abuses by U.S. intelligence agencies. Those hearings, broadcast live to a stunned public, became a slow-motion confession of how the invisible machinery of influence had really worked. Former case officers testified from behind screens, their voices disguised. They spoke of newspapers that had printed CIA-drafted articles, foundations that funneled secret funding, magazines and filmmakers who'd unknowingly served ideological goals. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was documented history being read into the record. When the subject of cultural propaganda surfaced, lawmakers fixated on Operation Mockingbird, the alleged network of journalists under agency direction. Officials dodged the details, saying only that certain relationships had existed during the Cold War's height. But behind closed doors, staffers reviewed classified memos linking the same covert budgets used in literary programs to overseas film festivals and cultural exchanges. The CIA's psychological warfare accounts were suddenly an issue of public accountability. The mighty Wurlitzer metaphor once quoted in secret briefings was now splashed across editorial cartoons. For the first time, Americans confronted the idea that freedom of expression might have been a managed narrative. The irony wasn't lost on the press covering the hearings. Reporters asked whether democracy itself had been marketed like a movie. One senator compared the agency's strategy to writing the script of the free world without telling the cast. The revelations didn't end with the committee. In 1977, Carl Bernstein published his Rolling Stone article, The CIA and the Media, expanding the picture dramatically. He documented over 400 American journalists who had secretly carried out assignments for the agency during the Cold War. Some were correspondents for respected outlets, others freelance writers whose exclusive interviews had been arranged through embassy contacts. The story spread like wildfire. If newspapers could be infiltrated, what about Hollywood? Critics ensued. Scholars began asking whether film projects might also have been quietly steered, especially those with overtly anti-communist messages. The timing shook the entertainment industry just as cinema was becoming more politically daring. Inside the CIA, the leadership scrambled to contain the fallout. Director George H.W. Bush ordered an internal review and promised reform. The agency announced it would no longer employ journalists or clergy as covers. But the statement was careful in its wording. It banned direct employment, not informal cooperation. The language left room for the same ambiguity that had fueled decades of influence. Behind closed doors, older officers called the decision the end of an era. Younger analysts called it necessary damage control. Public reaction was fierce but divided. Some citizens felt vindicated, proof at last that government secrecy had reached cultural life. Others took comfort in the explanation that such tactics had been defensive, not deceitful. Editorials in the late 197s debated whether moral boundaries applied in ideological war. Was a poem funded to resist Stalin any more corrupt than a bullet fired to stop him? The line between protection and manipulation blurred under the weight of rationalization. Meanwhile, journalists who'd been unknowingly linked to CIA programs faced crisis. Careers collapsed overnight. Some denied involvement, others admitted cooperation, but insisted patriotism had guided them, not money. The tangle of guilt, justification, and disbelief became a microcosm of America's fractured trust. People who had spent decades believing in institutional honesty now questioned every headline and every cinematic victory. The spell was breaking. In Hollywood, the reckoning arrived indirectly but unmistakably. Filmmakers newly emboldened by the 197 spirit of truth-telling began scrutinizing the national mythos itself. Political thrillers like The Parallax View and 3 Days of the Condor mirrored public paranoia, portraying intelligence agencies as manipulative bureaucracies. Those films weren't produced by the CIA, they were reactions to it. After years of invisible persuasion, the pendulum swung toward exposure as art. The spy, once glamorized as hero, became a symbol of mistrust. Back in Washington, congressional investigators demanded transparency in how the government engaged with the arts. Declassified documents revealed payments to cultural fronts like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, art exhibits underwritten by the agency, and academic journals that had served as intellectual propaganda. The CIA defended these actions as non-political promotion of Western values. But by then, semantics couldn't soften perception. For the public, the idea that creativity could be choreographed from Langley felt like heresy against freedom itself. As the hearings unfolded, the agency attempted to pivot. Officials emphasized that America's cultural power now lay in openness, not control. Privately, they acknowledged that the old methods had become liabilities. Covert credibility, once the agency's strength, now undermined trust in every American message abroad. The strategy that had won hearts in foreign capitals was losing them at home. Still, there were those who mourned the exposure. Veteran officers argued that without covert cultural influence, the U.S. would fight the information war with one arm tied behind its back. They warned that the Soviets would continue using film and literature without remorse, while the West handcuffed itself with transparency. But that argument no longer held moral weight. The era of quiet manipulation was ending, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The very ideals it promoted, truth, freedom, individual conscience, now demanded accountability. When the Church Committee released its final report in 1976, it documented surveillance, coups, and assassinations. Yet the paragraphs on cultural operations lingered most hauntingly. They showed that influence could corrode integrity the same way violence corroded peace. In the aftermath, reforms mandated clearer oversight and periodic congressional review. The CIA's Directorate of Operations lost authority over public diplomacy, transferring that mission to the State Department and later to the United States Information Agency. But buried deep in the bureaucracy, the lesson persisted. Stories were still weapons, just subtler ones now governed by optics. Agencies learned to outsource persuasion, letting private industry and open markets echo the same messages more naturally. The movie camera and the press release replaced the pamphlet and the memo. Covert culture had simply gone mainstream. By decade's close, America faced a different kind of mirror. The nation that had mastered storytelling was now analyzing itself through it, screenings and investigations merging into confession. Directors staged paranoia on screen. Reporters chronicled it in print. The once hidden war for hearts and minds had turned inward, forcing Americans to ask who had been orchestrating the soundtrack of their belief all along. What emerged from that reckoning wasn't closure, but awareness. The veil of secrecy lifted just enough for people to glimpse how fragile truth could be when disguised as art. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with another narrative. And yet, paradoxically, the exposure only confirmed what the CIA had proven decades earlier. Control the story, and you control perception. Even scandal itself became another chapter in the script of influence, a final act in which revelation replaced propaganda, but the spotlight still shone from the same direction. Legacy. Influence redefined. After the storm of exposure in the 197s, the CIA withdrew from the spotlight, but the methods it pioneered didn't vanish. They simply evolved. What began as a covert experiment in steering art had become the blueprint for modern information warfare. In the new era, the agency didn't need to fund scripts or infiltrate newsrooms. The machinery of influence had learned to run itself. The cultural battlefield that once required hidden budgets now operated under daylight, disguised as cooperation, commerce, or patriotism. The tone changed, but the tune remained. The reforms following the Church Committee were meant to draw boundaries between intelligence and expression. In practice, those boundaries blurred almost immediately. The CIA's charter now forbade domestic propaganda, yet nothing prevented coordination with the Department of Defense, State Department, or private subcontractors abroad. In the 198s, those channels fused into a new, openly acknowledged institution, the Pentagon's Entertainment Liaison Office. Where the CIA once operated in secret, the military now offered partnerships, assistance with equipment, access to bases, consultation on realism at a cost. Scripts submitted for approval had to portray U.S. forces accurately, a word that politely meant favorably. For filmmakers, this arrangement was pragmatic. Cooperation saved millions in production expenses. For planners in Washington, it was cultural continuity by lawful means. The government no longer had to plant ideology. It could negotiate it. Action, blockbusters, and patriotic dramas of the Reagan era carried the message without a whisper from Langley. When a jet streaked through sunset skies to the thunder of triumphant music, no one needed to call it propaganda. It simply felt like pride. This shift marked the true legacy of Cold War manipulation. Overt censorship was replaced by market alignment. Hollywood's global ambition mirrored America's geopolitical reach, and both thrived on compelling narratives of freedom versus chaos. The CIA has shown that control required neither ownership nor coercion, only incentive. Once that principle entered the commercial bloodstream, ideological symmetry became business as usual. Behind the scenes, former officers who'd honed cultural strategies in the 195s drifted into consulting and advertising. They brought with them the same psychological insights once used against the Kremlin: emotional framing, moral dichotomy, and the power of repetition. The language of propaganda mutated into the language of branding. By the time the first Gulf War erupted in 1991, its television coverage blended seamlessly with Hollywood convention. Heroic pilots, villainous dictators, drama in real time. Viewers didn't see manufacturing of consent. They saw good storytelling. At Langley, internal reports referred to this new ecosystem as distributed influence. The goal was no longer to script the story, but to shape the environment in which stories were told. Partnerships with foundations, think tanks, and academic institutions replaced direct production. The same foundations that once bankrolled abstract art now supported film festivals, media training, and human rights documentaries. Projects aligned with democratic narratives but independent in appearance. The line between propaganda and philanthropy became impossible to trace. Meanwhile, Hollywood's appetite for authenticity ensured continued liaison. During the 199s and early 200s, films and television shows about intelligence, Patriot Games, Spy Game, Alias consulted directly with agency public affairs officers. For the CIA, cooperation promised soft repair of its battered reputation after Vietnam, Watergate, and Iran-Contra. Each sympathetic portrayal humanized espionage, recasting it as duty instead of deceit. The old secrecy had failed. Controlled transparency offered redemption. When Argo won the Oscar in 2013, the agency's social media accounts congratulated the filmmakers. The circle had closed. Influence no longer hid, it posed for photos. Internationally, soft power matured into policy. Globalization turned entertainment into diplomacy. Streaming platforms replaced cultural attaches. Yet the underlying logic remained identical to that conceived by Frank Wisner in 1948. Win minds by making your version of reality pleasurable. Governments partnered with studios to promote narratives of empowerment and inclusion, values that also validated Western institutions. The persuasion was now ambient, an emotional climate rather than a campaign. Scholars who traced this lineage found striking continuity. The CIA's orchestration of Animal Farm was an early prototype, what modern strategists call information dominance. Replace film reels with algorithms, and the principle stands: manipulate the feed, not the message. During the 21st century's wars of perception, terrorism, cyber conflict, election interference, the lessons of Hollywood echoed. Through digital space, truth competed not on accuracy but on engagement. The spectacle had become the substance. Inside Langley, veterans of the Cold War cultural ops watched this transition with a mix of pride and unease. Some called it vindication, proof their theories about narrative power had anticipated the media age. Others saw danger. One retired officer reportedly warned that we taught the world too well. Indeed, rival powers adopted the same tactics: reflexive control, soft propaganda, entertainment diplomacy. What had once been a uniquely American weapon became a common global vernacular. Back home, filmmakers continued to navigate the uneasy alliance between creativity and image management. Requests for military hardware still passed through liaison offices. Scripts still underwent diplomatic sensitivity checks. Yet cooperation was voluntary, and audiences, saturated with irony, assumed complicity as natural. The old moral outrage faded into apathy. Viewers no longer asked who shaped the message because every brand, studio, and influencer was shaping one. The apparatus perfected under the Cold War had dissolved into everyday culture. Still, the legacy wasn't purely cynical. Many of the artworks birthed under covert patronage transcended their origins. Jazz diplomacy fostered genuine cross-cultural exchange. Government-funded exhibits introduced new forms of expression. Even Animal Farm, stripped of its manipulative intent, remains a powerful parable against totalitarianism. The machinery of influence created accidental art, masterpieces whose integrity outlasted their sponsors. Perhaps that irony is history's compromise. Propaganda that once liberated from secrecy turns into universal truth. As the 21st century unfolded, intelligence agencies rebranded influence as strategic communication. Hollywood called it collaboration. Social networks labeled it content. Yet in each variation lived the same assumption: stories shape behavior. The terminology evolved, the platforms multiplied, but the mindset born in the ashes of World War II never vanished. The Cold War proved that perception could be managed like territory, and that revelation changed civilization's operating code. In the end, the CIA didn't just weaponize Hollywood. It rewired the relationship between state and storyteller. Every partnership between government and media, every patriotic blockbuster or humanitarian campaign carries that inheritance. The tools are legal now, the motives often noble, but the precedent remains: beliefs can be engineered through beauty. The screen became diplomacy, and the audience became citizen and recruit simultaneously. That is the quiet legacy of the covert cultural war, a legacy no declassification can erase. The slogans disappeared, the habits endured. When modern viewers cheer for heroes defending freedom, they're echoing melodies composed in the 195s. When filmmakers balance art with access, they're reenacting the bargain struck decades ago between secrecy and spectacle. The manipulation that once hid beneath projectors now lives inside the spectacle itself. And so the influence continues, refined, normalized, invisible. The Cold War ended on paper, but its greatest invention, narrative control, remains undefeated. Every story told for cause or commerce carries a trace of the original experiment, the faith that emotion can move history. In that sense, the CIA's once covert operation achieved its ultimate victory. It no longer needs secrecy because its ideology became culture, what it all meant. The real Cold War battlefield was never just political, it was psychological. Missiles and armies drew the headlines, but the deeper fight unfolded in every cinema, classroom, and living room where people decided what version of the world they would believe. The CIA understood early that whoever controlled imagination controlled allegiance. It learned that power could travel through emotions faster than policy ever could, and that art, when tuned to purpose, could move mountains without leaving fingerprints. Across 3 decades, that invisible contest forged a paradox. Democracies defended freedom by secretly guiding its expression. Artists became soldiers without uniforms. Audiences became partisans without knowing they'd enlisted. The irony is still breathtaking. To prove that liberal values triumphed over oppression, Washington built a network that mirrored the very manipulation it condemned. Yet those tactics worked. Soviet propaganda never matched the seduction of abundance, color, and rhythm that poured from the American screen. In retrospect, the cultural campaigns look less like deception and more like revelation of a deeper truth. Stories rule nations as surely as armies. The agents in Langley didn't invent that law, they only industrialized it. But the Cold War refining the covert practice is now daily routine. Governments, corporations, even influencers compete to script emotion using tools polished in that era of secrecy. The distinctions between persuasion and information, between entertainment and ideology, dissolved long ago. But influence cuts both ways. When you weaponize art, you inherit its unpredictability. The same machinery that sold freedom eventually produced dissent, satire, and doubt. Out-of-controlled optimism grew the counterculture that questioned all authority, including its covert benefactors. The message escaped the message makers. In trying to choreograph belief, the CIA helped create a generation that refused choreography altogether. That paradox might be the truest measure of freedom, when propaganda teaches people to resist propaganda. Today, the legacy feels atmospheric. Hollywood still collaborates with government offices, and global media still reflects national interests, but the coordination is routine, not clandestine. The great experiment normalized itself. What once required hidden budgets now travels as branding, public diplomacy, or algorithmic curation. Everyone fights information wars. Few admit it's the same old playbook. The Cold War never ended. It just blended into the background noise of persuasion that defines modern life. Strip away the secrecy, and what remains is a simple recognition: imagination is infrastructure. The United States won its standoff with the Soviet Union not only because of weapons or wealth, but because its myths proved more infectious. A teenager in Warsaw yearning for blue jeans was a victory greater than any treaty. A movie scene sparking laughter behind an iron curtain was psychological high ground captured without bloodshed. Those were the quiet conquests of an empire built on narrative. Yet victories built on illusion eventually demand honesty. The declassified archives read like mirrors, reflecting the uneasy truth that virtue and manipulation often share the same language. Freedom sold too perfectly begins to resemble control. The lesson of the CIA's Hollywood experiment isn't that propaganda corrupted art. It's that art will always serve power unless its audience insists otherwise. Awareness becomes the only safeguard in a world where inspiration doubles as strategy. So when the credits roll on this hidden chapter of history, what remains is a question of agency. Not the agency in Virginia, but the one inside every viewer. Will we recognize the persuasion woven into beauty? Or will we, like those theatergoers in 1954, applaud the story and never wonder who wrote it? That question is still the front line, because the war for the mind never ended. It only changed its medium. If you want to keep uncovering the unseen history shaping the world you think you know, subscribe and join us for the next story. The next reel is already spinning.